Good afternoon, everybody. How are you guys doing? Everyone have something good to eat? Yeah? Anybody steak out there? Steak? We had some French fries for dinner, us. Good, right? Homemade French fries? Delicious. Welcome to church. We're going to have a wonderful time together talking about creation, about Genesis, about how we can trust that what God says in His Word is true. So we have a guest speaker. Mr. Keaton Howard is here to speak to us. So round of applause for him. We appreciate his time coming out. Before we get to him, though, we're going to go ahead and sing just a quick praise and worship song together, just as a time of fellowship. So if you would, we'd invite you to stand, and let's praise together.
All right, I didn't tell the sound people what we're singing. So 406, this morning, we used the hymnal, so we're going to use it again tonight. 406. Lord, we thank you that you are our solid rock. We can stand on you in good times and bad times. And just help us to put our trust in you day by day. Thank you for these that have come to lead us today. Bless them as they share tonight from your word. In Jesus' name we pray.
All right, good evening. Welcome back. It's nice to be with you for a third message today. And maybe I'll start with a joke this evening. I told one or two of the children this morning. This is when I spoke on dinosaurs years ago. A boy told me this joke, and it's become my favorite dinosaur joke. So, why can't dinosaurs clap? Because they're dead. So. But we got dinosaurs out of the way this morning. We learned all about dead things like rocks and fossils. So tonight we're going to talk about living things, because that's a big part of this debate, creation versus evolution as well. So we want to ask this question: how did living things come about to begin with? Were they engineered by an ingenious creator, as the Bible teaches, or did they come about through some blind, unguided, purposeless evolutionary process as Charles Darwin believed and popularized? Well, it's always struck me that regardless of who you're talking to, no matter what a person's worldview and whether they believe in creation or evolution, when we're looking out at some of the grandeur of nature's greatest beasts, such as, we'll see if this works tonight. Do I need to do something different here? No? Well, you might have to run it for me from the back then. Go ahead and advance one slide. What's that?
Point that direction.
Okay, that's a good call.
Yep.
But no, not working. If you want to maybe run up to me the other clicker that we used this morning. There, that's where I want to go. Thank you. All right. So as I was saying, no matter who you talk to, when they look at the grandeur of one of nature's greatest beasts, like a giant whale, or whether we're talking about mine's working now. All right, if you want to just leave it there, I'll grab it if need be. Or we're looking at the intricate, details of the eye of a tiny insect. Everyone's first impression is that someone must have made this. Somebody, some person, some, intelligent agent, because the world has all this beauty and sophisticated complexity. It appears to be design, and if we find design in living things, that would imply there must be a designer who stands behind it. So the Bible affirms that intuition that we all have. Uh-oh. There we go. Here in Romans chapter 1, verse 20, it talks about how God's invisible attributes can be known, not just from what he's revealed in Scripture, but from nature. It says God's invisible attributes, and specifically his eternal power, he's very powerful, his divine nature, the fact that it is God who's the designer rather than just some vague, intelligent designer that we don't know who it is. No, it's God himself. These invisible attributes have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. From what? In the things that have been made. You find the things that have been made, then there must be a maker of those things. So this verse in Romans actually says that people are without excuse for not believing. It's so obvious that God is real that nobody can stand before the Lord on Judgment Day and say, I had no reason to believe in you, Lord. The evidence is all around them. But it's not only the Bible that affirms this. Here's the testimony of some atheists in this regard. Richard Dawkins, for example, you might know his name. He's a leading evolutionist, one of the world's most famous atheists today. He doesn't believe in creation. He's a staunch defender of evolution. This whole book, The Blind Watchmaker, he wrote to say that evolution can make complicated objects like a watch without a watchmaker. It's the blind watchmaker with no foresight, no intelligence is necessary. It's designed without a designer. But look at the way he defines biology on page 1 of this book. Biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. Dawkins doesn't believe living things were designed, but he admits they look like they were designed. He spends the whole rest of the book trying to say design is an illusion. It's not really there. Or similarly, Francis Crick is one of the co-discoverers of the structure of DNA, a brilliant scientist, but sadly he also does not believe in God. Look at what he says. Biologists must constantly keep in mind that what they see was not designed, but rather evolved. Now, why did these brilliant men of science have to keep reminding themselves that evolution is true to their thinking? Because even to them, it looks like the world, especially living things, were designed. So the intuition is there, and it's obvious to everyone. But the real question then is, who's right about how to understand it? Are Christians right that the design is real, or is Darwin and his associates right that the design is just apparent but not real? It's an illusion. To be fair to these atheists, we can sometimes be fooled in thinking we see design when it's not in fact the case. One of my favorite examples of this would be back in the 1970s when the Voyager spacecraft was flying past the planet Mars, taking some close-up photos of the Martian landscape for the very first time. Some of those detailed black and white photos came back with craters from up above and hillsides. But this particular detail you're seeing there, you see the face right in the center? Looks like it's been carved into that Martian hillside. And some people at the time got all excited about this. They called it the face on Mars. And they thought, hey, this is proof of extraterrestrials. It must be, because we see design in this hillside, that the hillside had a designer, aliens, Martians, who carved that face for us to observe. But it shouldn't surprise you, given that the appearance of a face there is quite superficial, right? It's not really detailed and complex. And so when another spacecraft flew past Mars with better resolution imaging from another angle in different lighting, the same hillside looks like, oops, I've gone ahead too much. Sorry, darn. That's one slide I did not want to jump ahead on. Can we go back just one, if you would? The hillside doesn't look like a face, right? It looks like that can be explained by the laws of nature alone without additional intelligence. Just physics, just gravity, wind, erosion, and so forth can account for this. It doesn't need anything beyond the laws of nature by themselves to explain that hillside. And so atheists want to say that's what life is like. It appears to be designed, but the design inference is a mistake. It's an illusion. But I want to say no, to the contrary. It's like this example you already saw. If we had flown satellites past that hillside and seen a hill that looked like that, now nobody would say that that came about by accident, by any kind of time and chance processes, no matter what you invoke, by the laws of nature alone. That's not going to come about without intelligence. It's somebody that designed these features and carved them. And how can you tell the difference? It's because of the level of sophistication and complexity in this second example. So I want to argue that, to the contrary, life is like this second example. The more we look into these details, the more clear it is that life must have had a designer. Design that we see, that everybody sees, is not an illusion. It is the best explanation. So what we're going to do as kind of an outline for tonight, we'll look through 4 common ways that evolutionists say they have good evidence for their view that all living things share ancestry. And here are the evidences you kind of will read about in biology textbooks for high school students, or you'll see on television documentaries and so forth. Number 1, they say we have vestigial structures. And we'll talk about what each of these are one by one and unpack them in more detail. Do vestigial structures prove evolution? Or what about the similarities that we see in living things? Does that show all living things are related? What about the changes that we can watch in real time? Does that prove evolution? Or finally, we'll look at the cruelty in nature and see that even evolutionists argue from a theological perspective rather than a scientific one. They think they have evidence from theology to prove evolution. But it turns out when we look at these details, just like the Martian landscape, in every case, nope, the sophistication, the beauty, the complexity shows that the better explanation is that living things had a designer. And so biblical creation is where the evidence points, not toward evolution. When you examine the details, the impression of design doesn't disappear, it actually grows even stronger. So let's see how that is the case. Starting with number 1, we're going to look at vestigial structures first. Now, what am I talking about there? Well, the word vestige, it just means like a remnant or a trace of something. So say you're at the beach and you see all these human footprints in the sand there. The footprints are a vestige of a person having once walked on the beach, right? A remnant or a trace left behind. And you've probably heard of this idea that humans have vestigial organs in our bodies. Things like the tonsils, the human appendix, the tailbone. Evolutionists frequently say that these structures serve no purpose in our bodies. That all they do is point to the fact that we actually came from animal ancestors and we inherited these organs that may have served a purpose millions of years ago in our animal ancestors, but they serve no function in the human body today. So if God made these human beings, why would he give us functionless organs in our bodies? They say these functionless organs, vestigial organs, point to the truth of evolution. Well, in principle, creationists don't have to deny that there is any such thing as a vestigial organ, because even if God designed humans separately from any animal, it's true that over time, as mutations accumulate in our gene pool, that certain organs might get damaged and no longer function. We might lose function in certain things in the human community over time. Or other animals, it's the same thing. And I believe there are some genuine examples of vestigial structures, vestigial organs in the world, like in dark caves. It turns out many of the organisms, like fish and other creatures in the caves, often lose the coloration in their skin, and they lose the ability to see. So all the fish are actually like born, if you will, hatched, or whatever a fish is. The fish come about without sight. They just have scar tissue where on a healthy fish, normal eyes would grow. They're blind cave fish. So that's a genuine example of a vestigial organ. The creationists and evolutionists would agree on the explanation that these fish descended from earlier fish ancestors that had functioning eyes. And some mutations, or for whatever reason, maybe they switched off the information because they didn't need it in these dark caves. Eyes don't help you at all if the cave is dark anyway. So whether it was random mutations that broke their genetic instructions, or whether the fish have complex programming in their DNA to switch these things off themselves, either way, it's a loss of sight, and it's not something that proves evolution. It's consistent with God making a good design initially, and then defects and damage occurring since the time of the fall. But the problem here is that, despite a few examples that we would agree with, the vast majority of what evolutionists claim are vestigial structures are not vestigial after all. Way back in 1925, so this was 100 years ago now, the famous Scopes monkey trial occurred, where Tennessee passed a law that you couldn't teach human evolution specifically. And the ACLU challenged that in court, and they had all this expert evolutionary scientist testimony get entered into the court records. And so what was all this proof that they had for evolution back then? Well, vestigial organs was a major plank in their argument. And the scientists argued there are no less than 180 vestigial structures in the human body. Wow, really? 180 different things in our bodies have no purpose, no function? Well, guess what? Since that time, we've discovered functions for each one of these body parts. So it turns out that argument was based on ignorance, something they didn't understand. They've come to learn these things actually do perform functions. So what about some of the particulars here? When we talk about the human tailbone, for example, I went to the American Museum of Natural History just back in 2017, and I took this photo of this sign for myself. It's about the human tailbone, also known as the coccyx. And what that is down at the base of our spine, where it connects to our pelvis, that's called the sacrum, that major fused together bone there. But then just beneath that is this little triangular bone. If I can circle it there, that is the human tailbone. So it's the end of our spinal column. And so evolutionists say, well, here's what the signage says at this famous world-class museum. Look closely at the base of the human spine, and you'll find a tailbone, 3 to 5 vertebrae fused together. It serves no purpose, they say, but reminds us that humans have descended from ancestral animals with tails. Is that what that proves? We came from tailed ancestors from monkeys. Our tailbone doesn't do anything at all. But that just astonishes me, given the fact that if you consult experts on anatomy and physiology, they will tell you that there are all kinds of muscles and tendons and ligaments that are connected to that tailbone. It serves as an anchor point to help stabilize these different things. And the muscles perform particular functions. They help to hold in the internal organs of our bodies in our abdomen there. They're also used for various functions that we perform, like bearing weight when we're seated. And when we lean back, the tailbone has to bear even more of our weight, because it's like we have a tripod there in our pelvis. We've got 2 bones in the front of our pelvis, and then the third leg is that tailbone in the rear. They're used in bathroom functions in women, helping to give birth and so forth. And so it's just nonsense to say that the tailbone serves absolutely no purpose. Now, it's not essential to human beings. Sometimes people fall and break their tailbone, and they might have to even get it removed. You can live without it, but you can live without your left arm as well, can't you? Does that prove your left arm serves no function whatsoever in your body? No, you lose an arm, the rest of your body has to work harder to make up for the deficiency, and the same thing is true with your tailbone. Another example, the human appendix. This is a little worm-like process that comes off your large intestine. It's sometimes called the variform appendix, which means worm-like. Okay, it looks like a worm. But what is the purpose of the appendix? Well, we still don't entirely know. There's probably more to be discovered about what function the appendix was intended by God to perform, but we have some idea that it serves in our immune system. When we eat food, kind of a first line of defense would be our tonsils, right? But then the food passes through us, and when it's nearly finished through that process, the appendix is like serving the same immune function, likely at the other end of the system. It has all kinds of lymphatic tissue and so on that indicates that is part of its role. But another thing scientists recognize the appendix does, they call it a bacterial safe house. What that means is when we get certain types of illnesses, we have a lot of good bacteria in our gut that aid in our digestion. But certain types of illnesses come from bad bacteria, and so the gut expels all the good and bad bacteria together. Well, we need our gut to be replenished with the good, healthy bacteria. Where do they come from? Well, one very helpful place would be this extra storage unit. The appendix can house some of these good bacteria so they can repopulate our gut more rapidly and help us to recover faster than we would without the appendix. But my favorite point to make regarding the appendix is even if you believe the evolutionary story, the evolutionists, when they look at the way the appendix appears, not just in human beings, but in many types of animals, different types of animals have different types of appendixes. Some have it, some don't. And so they are forced to say, not that the appendix evolved once and then got passed on in all kinds of different organisms. They say, rather, that the appendix evolved on separate branches of the evolutionary tree independently many, many times. At least 17 times, they say the appendix evolved into existence. So even if you believe in evolution, clearly the appendix must have a role, must have an important function for it to come into existence again and again and again. But I think that argument actually shows how silly the evolutionary story is, that there's no way the same organ evolved just by chance again and again on separate branches of the evolutionary tree. Rather, I think the Bible has the best explanation here. The psalmist says, I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it very well. So we've looked at the first argument for evolution. Does vestigial organs prove evolution? Not at all. The genuine ones are consistent with a good creation followed by the bad effects of the fall. But most things once thought to be useless turn out to be functional after all. And we keep discovering more and more junk DNA. Scientists used to call a lot of our non-coding DNA. It turns out it's not junk, but that was their name for it. Junk DNA is not in fact junk at all, as we're learning more and more today. But let's move on to another argument, that is the similarities between living things. Now this is a major way they argue in the textbooks, for example. If you look at these different organisms here. Now creationists would say that God made these different types of creatures separate from one another. They didn't evolve from a common ancestor. But evolutionists say, hang on, that's what the evidence points to. Look at the similarities in the patterns of bones in these arms and legs. Okay, so humans, for example, we've got one bone in our upper arm, then an elbow joint, 2 bones in our lower arm, and then a wrist joint, and then 5 digits in the hand. And it turns out all these creatures have that same pattern in both arms and legs. Despite the fact that frogs use their legs for hopping, birds use their wings for flying, seals use their flippers for swimming, and so forth. Lots of very different functions, and yet why do they all have that same pattern? The evolutionists say because already millions of years before, the common ancestor of all these vertebrates had that 5-digit limb pattern, and evolution just tinkered with a pre-existing blueprint for a limb, and it tweaked the design, but it didn't radically alter it. And they say that's a better explanation than God, because why would one God create such different organisms with the same plan, even though their limbs serve different purposes? Okay, well that's one possible explanation we can consider, but are creationists, do we not have an explanation here? No, it does make sense to say that one God might have good reasons for giving these diverse organisms the same blueprint in their limbs. For one thing, there may be the fact that it makes good engineering sense. Even though, they're using them for different purposes, they're moving in similar ways, and they have similar stresses and so forth. Even humans, when we make robotic arms, we often incorporate a lot of these same features. And the more experts, engineers, and so forth study these limbs, they realize the ingenious nature of the bones in your wrist, for example. A brilliant engineer named Stuart Burgess from the UK has designed bicycles that have won competitions in Olympic races. And he points out just how astonishingly genius the wrist and ankle bones are in our bodies, how they can serve competing functions, both to be strong but also flexible at the same time. But beyond this, also God might have even artistic reasons. It might serve aesthetic purposes to design. You think about human artists, a composer is going to repeat themes in his work, and human designers who build automobiles, right? They have a lot of similarities, even though automobiles didn't evolve from a bicycle millions of years ago. But then are we just at a standoff where the creationists and evolutionists both can offer an explanation for the similarity, but nobody can say who's right? Well, I think there are additional points to be made that disfavor the evolutionary explanation. In the details, the evolutionary story falls apart. For example, if the reason for the similarity between human hands and frog feet is because they share a common ancestor, then you would expect as the embryos develop in the womb or in the egg that they would develop these digits in the same way. But it turns out they develop radically differently. So with the human hand and the frog foot, the human hand begins like a plate, and the material in between the fingers dissolves away as we're growing as embryos. But the frog foot begins like a stump, a fist, and the initial buds here grow outward as digits. So not dissolving away, but growing outward, a radically different path to arrive at the same design solution. And maybe God did it that way just to cause problems for the evolutionary stories that we hear all the time. But there are many other examples of how similarities, far from proving evolution, they cause problems for evolution. Okay, some similarities might fit the evolutionary story, but other similarities, like the similarity between human eyes and octopus eyes. Now, there are a lot of different types of eyes out there in the world. You think about insects have a totally different type of eye than human beings do. But humans have a camera lens system, and it turns out octopuses also have a camera lens eye. Now, what's the reason for the similarity? Would any evolutionist say millions of years ago the common ancestor between humans and octopuses already had a camera eye system in place, and then they just passed that on to all their descendants? No, not at all. They have to say, just like the appendix I shared about earlier, on separate branches of the evolutionary tree, just by coincidence, this type of eye evolved more than once. Now, you folks thought it was hard enough to explain how an eye could come into existence even one time, especially an eye as complex as the human eye. But evolutionists say it happens over 60 different times. Eyes have evolved separately, according to their story. I submit the truth is that blind forces of nature cannot make a seeing eye. Rather, here again, the Bible makes the best sense, where it says in Proverbs 20, the hearing ear and the seeing eye, the Lord has made them both. And you think about texts like, when God speaks to Moses at the burning bush, and he says, who made man's mouth, and so forth. God takes credit for all these minutiae of our bodies. He didn't just light the fuse at the Big Bang and let things go from there. No, God is intimately involved in the details of our creation. He designed us with, his ingenious nature. Now, I think it's a bit rich to even use similarities in principle as an argument for evolution, because manufactured objects made by human beings, as I've already alluded to, they exhibit the same sort of patterns of similarity as these evolutionary trees. Okay, go into your kitchen tonight, you can dump out your silverware drawer and arrange it into a tree where you group similar things together and more dissimilar things farther apart. You can build a tree that looks like a tree of ancestry, but does that prove your silverware evolved? Not at all. Manufactured objects have these patterns of similarity. Or, we had Mexican for lunch today. I don't know if you ever thought about the evolution of Mexican food, but did the chimichanga evolve from a tortilla millions of years ago? Not at all. Just because you can group things in this way doesn't demonstrate evolution. These things were designed by intelligent agents. So we've looked at vestigial structures, similarities. Let's look at the third argument for evolution. That has to do with the changes that we can witness before our very eyes. Now, we do watch living things change over time. We watch bacteria become resistant to antibiotics. We watch animals adapt to different environments and so forth. In fact, it's fascinating to study many of these changes. But evolutionists often treat this as though creationists must deny any and all changes. If you think about all the varieties of domestic dogs in the world today, creationists long before Darwin recognized that these dog breeds came about because of human intervention, dog breeders getting involved and making significant changes. The original, all these modern dog breeds like poodles and dachshunds and chihuahuas and so forth, they weren't around at the time of Adam and Eve. They've come about in recent times because living things can change and adapt, especially if human beings get involved, okay? And really, that's not a surprise to a Bible-believing Christian. The Bible has led many people to expect that we should see lots of changes in biological organisms, you know? And the reason they thought that is because when they considered the account of Noah's flood, Noah took just 2 of every type of land-dwelling, air-breathing creature aboard the ark just thousands of years ago. But since that time, we've got to explain all the modern varieties of these domestic dog breeds, but also lots of other, you know, with elephants. Is it Asian elephants and African elephants and mammoths and so forth? All of these likely belong to one biblical kind, not many different kinds, even though they're classified as different species. So on the one hand, the Bible leads us to expect a significant amount of change is possible, but it also does lead us to expect that there are limits to the changes, because in Genesis 1, it talks about how God did make distinct kinds of plants and animals. He spoke them into existence supernaturally. He even made different things on different days of creation week. He made the swimming creatures and flying creatures on the 5th day. He made the land animals, different kinds, on day 6, and then he created humans separately from the apes. He made Adam from the dust. He made Eve out of Adam's rib, right? So we had a supernatural origin to the different basic kinds of creatures, and especially human beings. So then if we try to understand how then does the Bible's term kind, it's not a technical scientific term, but if there are distinct kinds of plants and animals, then how does that term kind relate to the modern day species? Should we equate those two? Well, even before Charles Darwin, people like Linnaeus realized that no, we should not equate those two. A kind is a broader category. Within one kind, you can sometimes have multiple species. So if we think about cats for a good example here, if you look at today's world, we've got lions, tigers, leopards. These are given different species names. Does that mean creationists should affirm that God made 2 lions in the Garden of Eden, and lions and tigers were separately created, lions and tigers separately aboard the ark? Or could it be that these cats are related? They're one kind, it turns out, not separate kinds. One kind with multiple species within the kind. And how can we tell whether that's right or wrong, whether lions were created separately from tigers? Well, a good test is if you can breed them together and they can produce offspring, then they belong to the same kind. And do you know what you get if you cross a male lion with a female tiger? You get a liger. These are actually real healthy cats, as you can see on the screen there. Oops, I've already moved to the next one. That's fine, we'll stay there. But ligers are not made up mythological animals with magical powers. And they're just one example of many different mammals that we can illustrate, different hybrids here. So if you cross a camel and a llama, that will give you a comma. If you cross a cow and a buffalo, that gives you a beefalo. Cross a zebra and a donkey, that makes a zonkey. Or there's a horse and a zebra makes a zorse. If you cross a goat and a sheep, that makes a jeep. Or actually, a jeep is what you drive. It's pronounced a geep, it turns out. Let's see, there's I don't know if you want to advance it, if you're helping me out there. There it is, okay, the geep there. And then a cross between a pig and a boar. They actually haven't named that one, so it's just pig and boar cross. In the wild, some explorers discovered a cross between a polar bear and a grizzly bear to make a pizzly bear. And even if you ever go to Hawaii, you can see there at SeaWorld, Hawaii, they've got, at one time they had a tank that enclosed both a dolphin and what's called a false killer whale. And it's a much larger than a dolphin. But the curators were surprised when one of them became pregnant and along came a baby wholphin calf. Now, by the way, sometimes these animals are fertile. They might be sterile, but even if you can, so they can go on, like you can have with the ligers, you can go on to have ligers. And the wholphin went on to have more baby wholphin calves. But even if they're sterile, just the fact that they can be produced by crosses from different species shows that the two species belong to one biblical kind. So that helps to illustrate what creationists have been saying all along, that yes, lots of variation is possible. From the original cat kind, we've gotten diversity, like lions and tigers. And if lions don't breed together with the other cats, in the wild, they tend to just breed with other lions. then they stay true to that species. But that doesn't mean lions and tigers can't be related. So lots of diversity from the original DNA God built into the cat kind, but that doesn't mean the diversity is unlimited. And this is the way students, I think, often get confused when their evolutionary professors in the classroom say, how can you deny evolution? We can observe it happening. Just look around at all the changes. Look at the butterflies changing in my laboratory. Evolution is a fact. But when he's seeing this so-called evolution, I would rather call that just a variation or adaptation. It's not evolution in the sense that the student is being led to believe that it demonstrates beyond doubt that microbes have turned into mankind over millions of years. Just because we see changes doesn't mean the changes can accomplish anything at all. And there are good reasons to believe that the changes have limits from biology itself. For instance, one of the barriers to getting one kind to change into a different kind is that living things are programmed in our DNA with genetic information. The DNA molecule, DNA, if you don't know, stands for definitely no accident. It didn't come about by chance, but it contains books and books worth of information. As even Richard Dawkins admits here, he says there's enough information capacity in a single human cell to store the Encyclopedia Britannica, all 30 volumes of it, 3 or 4 times over. Now, our young people might not know what an encyclopedia is, but you can consult your parents later on to find out. A big, thick book, okay? Lots of information inside even one of these. And Dawkins is saying there's far more information in every cell in our bodies where our DNA is located. So the big question for evolutionists is the changes that we see occurring today, are these the types of changes that add new information to the genomes of these organisms? And this is an important question because in the evolutionary story, way back down on the evolutionary tree at the time, say, when there were only single-celled creatures, no trees had evolved yet, how did the instructions to genetically, the DNA that codes for tree bark get written? By natural processes alone. Are the changes we see now the types of changes that build up and create new instructions to make tree bark? Or later on, when there were trees in the world, but there were no birds yet, how did the instructions, the DNA code to make feathers in birds come about? How did that get written without intelligence, by natural processes alone? And when they point to changes that we do see happening, these are not the types of changes that are writing new information. They're degrading information instead, maybe just shuffling it around, but not producing something fundamentally new to build up new machinery and complex instructions. So let's look at some examples of this. Now, there are changes that creationists agree with, like natural selection is a real process, but can natural selection produce new information? No, even in the name, it tells you all it can do is select from what previously existed. It has to already be there in order for nature to select it. What do I mean by this? Well, let's give some examples of how natural selection works. We already talked about how domestic dogs, modern dog breeds, were brought about by human breeders getting involved in this process. That's sometimes called artificial selection. But natural selection is when humans aren't so much involved, and it just happens on its own by environmental conditions. So these domestic dogs would also be related to wolves, coyotes, dingoes, and jackals. And those changes might have been brought about, maybe some by human involvement, but perhaps more so by nature alone. So how does this sort of process work? Well, let me give you one simplified example here of genetics and illustrate natural selection. Imagine after Noah's flood, we have 2 wolf-like creatures coming off the ark, and let's say they have a certain gene that codes for the length of their fur, but this gene comes in 2 flavors. Your biology textbooks will call that an allele. An allele is like one gene that comes in a different version. Okay, so 2 different flavors of the one gene. It's got a gene to make how long is the fur, but it comes in the L form for long fur, or the S form for short fur. And some genes work this way where they produce a blended effect if you've got one of each of the flavors. Okay, so these wolves have a gene for long fur and a gene for short fur. So how long is their fur? It's medium, neither long nor short. But what happens when they have puppies? Well, their offspring will get a random combination of one gene from dad and one gene from mom. And so some of the offspring will get an S gene from both parents. They will have short fur. Others will get the L and the S. Probably about 50% will have that combination, look just like mom and dad with medium fur. But then others will get the L gene, one from dad, one from mom, and they are born with long fur. Okay, so now, so far we have variation. Look, in a single generation, we've gone from medium fur dogs to a variety of options. We've got short, medium, and long. Is that evolution? No, we haven't seen any new information produced, just sorted out the information that God pre-programmed into these creatures. But here's where natural selection comes into play. Let's say there's a very harsh winter where many of these dogs live, and it's so cold that it kills off all of the dogs with short and medium fur. They don't survive this harsh winter. So let's get rid of them. Who's left behind? Only the dogs with long fur. So nature, in a sense, you could say, selected the dogs for long fur. When they reproduce, what kind of puppies will they have? Their offspring will only have long fur, right? Because they no longer have the genes for short fur. So now we've gone in just 2 generations from dogs, wolves that have medium fur. And because of the cold climate, they've adapted. A couple generations later, they have only long fur. That's a good example of how natural selection works in principle. But is that evolution? Well, again, not in the sense of microbes to mankind over millions of years, because this is not an information gaining process. This change has only happened by getting rid of the genes for short fur. Do you see how this is a loss of information, not a gain of something fundamentally new? And so by this process, if you try to go the other direction, if you've only got the dogs with long fur and there's a heat wave, they're going to die of heat stroke. They're not going to adapt back to a warm climate unless somewhere in the population there are some genes still for the short fur. And so when we go to something like the more robust ancestral wolf down to our domestic varieties of dogs, we get there by a process of getting rid of the versatility they had to begin with, right? A variety of genes, we get rid of some of these genes to select for things like poor little Chihuahua, who's got very little information left at all. Chihuahuas, it turns out, are swimming in the shallow end of the gene pool. And they're full of all kinds of harmful mutations and mistakes as well. And the evolutionist might say, but yeah, you're forgetting, it's not natural selection on its own that produces evolution, but natural selection plus mutations. That's called the neo-Darwinian mechanism. That's how many modern evolutionists think of the theory, plus additional things as well. But the mutations add new information. Now, mutations are also something that creationists agree with. It's something we observe happening in the real world. And a good example might be if you have a healthy dog with normal long legs, as his genetic instructions are copied and passed on to his offspring, they might get a mistake is made in the copy. And so his puppies are born with short, stubby little legs. And mutations are typically like that. They're defects, they're mistakes, copying errors that cause damage. And you could sort of conceive of how it would obviously not add new information in most cases. Just like if you were typing out a phrase on your keyboard, like "to dust you shall return," but you accidentally hit the wrong key, there's a typo here, and you type an N instead of an O by mistake. Has that mutation, so to speak, a single letter change, has that added new information to this phrase? Well, it's changed the phrase, it's made it different from what it was originally, but in the English language, there's no such word as "you knew." So it's not produced new information, it's produced gobbledygook instead. And this is how most mutations are. Rather than producing something that's meaningful biologically that can help the organism to survive or be adapted to some environment, it just produces gobbledygook. And the more harmful single letter changes that occur in our DNA, the more likely it is that we will eventually die or go extinct as a species. Now, this is not to say that in principle it's impossible that a random mutation, couldn't generate new information, that couldn't be biologically meaningful. Or if we think again about the English example as a kind of an analogy here, could random typo changes actually make a meaningful phrase come into existence that wasn't there before, change it from what it was? Well, a good example I found in a parking lot one time, this sign says, "Violators will be towed and fined $50. Sounds pretty good to me, right? But there's a typo you can identify there. The original sign was not meant to say that. There's one letter missing, okay? But just by chance, the phrase still is meaningful. It's new information that's come about by chance. But you can sort of intuitively see how unlikely this would be, that you get new information by mutations, by random changes to the letters alone. Now, when we look at organisms, not down to the level of the DNA, but stand back and look at the effects on the body, it's pretty obvious how most mutations cause harm and are losses of information. This creature here, for example, is a chicken, a rooster, but it has a mutation that damaged its ability to make feathers. And so it cannot grow feathers. And we call this the TNR mutation, which stands for totally naked rooster. That's obvious how it's a loss of information, right? God built into these roosters the ability to grow feathers, and the mutation ruined that. It's a loss of instructions. But other instances might not be quite as obvious on the surface. Like this poor creature here is also a bird. It's supposed to look like this. It's a budgerigar when it's healthy and not mutant. There's the healthy budgie there. But what this creature has is a mutation that causes his feathers to grow more and more and more. His feathers actually don't stop growing. They keep growing and curl up. So he's just a big fluff ball. Now he's still living. He can't fly around, but he can hop around. And you can watch YouTube videos of this poor little guy online. But is that a good example of a mutation adding new genetic information? No, because birds are complex, their genome is sophisticated, and what they have are switches that are supposed to switch off making feathers once they've grown fully out. And his switch has been corrupted. It's damaged his ability to know how to shut off making feathers at the proper time. So even though he's growing more feathers, it's still a loss of information. What about the case where we have a duplication of some stretch of DNA or some body part, like this mutant turtle? He's not ninja, as far as I know, but there are mutant turtles out there in the world. He's got 2 copies of a head. Well, evolutionists might say, see, aha, it's new instructions, new information. But the hard thing is not to explain how to get a copy of a head once you've already got the instructions to make one head. What we need the evolutionists to explain is how to get the genetic instructions for a head, a turtle head, in the first place. And if you read 2 copies of the same newspaper, you read it through once and then read it through a second time, are you twice as informed? No, because it's the same information repeated 2 times. It's not really new information in the most important sense. Now, that's not to say, again, here, we might be able to quibble about some specific examples. Maybe there are some instances, I would admit, where a duplication might actually technically increase the information content, just by chance. Because some genes, the more copies you have of them, they're expressed differently. It might speed up the process and so forth. And so there might be some minor examples of duplications. In a technical sense, yeah, they're new information, something different that's helpful to the organism. And yet still, it's not the information in the most profound sense that we need evolutionists to account for. Where's all the examples that they can supply of new body parts coming into existence that we see the pathway of how the mutations occurred and how these things are changing over time? These are not the changes that we observe today. One more point on this. We also advise against saying that there's no such thing as a beneficial mutation, because there actually are mutations that can help an organism to survive better in a given environment. But it turns out even these helpful mutations are often losses of information. They are defects. A defect can be useful, so windy, and those beetles looked almost identical, except the beetles on the mainland had wings and they could fly. And Darwin, I think correctly, recognized or theorized that the wingless beetles descended from winged ancestors. Those winged beetles flew to these islands, and then something about the windy nature of the island made them lose their wings. Maybe it was a random mutation that damaged their wings, and Darwin himself thought it's because if you fly around on a windy island or you get blown into the sea and you drown, you don't leave offspring. Now, modern day scientists think that's probably not the most likely explanation. Rather, it's just a matter of energy. It takes a lot of energy to fly around in a windy environment, and so it's easier to crawl around and look for a mate and look for food on the ground. And so it may be that they're actually switching off the instructions in their DNA to make the wings. But in either case, creationists and evolutionists agree on what's happening here. And so this loss of wings, it's not an example of new information arising, but the loss of wings is actually an advantage on these windy islands in particular. Not on the mainland, but it's better for the beetles on the windy islands. So a defect can actually be helpful. It's a beneficial mutation in the sense that it enables the organism to pass on its DNA more frequently than the healthy wild type, the non-mutant, and yet it's still a loss. Not good proof for evolution at all. So we've looked at 3 different arguments for evolution: vestigial structures, similarities in living things, and changes in living things. Let's finally look at one more briefly. That is the cruelty in nature. The cruelty in nature, that doesn't sound like a scientific argument. Well, no, it's not. But if you've ever seen these nature documentaries on like Discovery Channel, Nova, PBS, have you as a Christian ever been frustrated by the narrative that's being spun about, oh, look at what evolution did, and they don't give the credit to the creator? Well, one of the most common narrators on these documentaries is the naturalist Sir David Attenborough. And lots of Christians have actually written him letters and said to him, why do you always give glory to evolution? You can't give glory to God. You can't recognize the handiwork of the creator in these living things. Well, David Attenborough has a response that he gives on occasions when Christians ask him that. Here's what he says. When creationists talk about God creating, they always instance hummingbirds or orchids, sunflowers, and beautiful things. But I tend to think instead of a parasitic worm that is boring through the eye of a boy in Africa, a worm that's going to make him blind. And I ask those creationists, are you telling me that the God you believe in, who designed these living things, who you say is an all-merciful God, who cares for each one of us individually, are you saying that God created and designed this parasitic worm? Because that doesn't seem to me to coincide with a God who's full of mercy. Well, I think that is rhetorically powerful, kind of a sobering thought from the likes of Sir David Attenborough. So what can we say in response to this as Christians? Is that proof that no God is the intelligent designer between living things? Because if so, he's cruel and heartless, making parasites and so forth. Well, a biblically informed answer would say, when God first made the world, he made it very good, as it says in Genesis 1:31, but the reason we have parasites and diseases and poisons and things in the world today is because of the effects of sin. Adam and Eve sinned, and then God cursed the ground, and nature has been corrupted ever since, longing to be redeemed, as it says in Romans chapter 8. And it turns out when you study these things from a scientific point of view, most parasites look like they were once healthy, independently living organisms, and because of damage to their DNA and so forth, they may have lost the ability to live without a host that they have to prey upon. Most bacteria are good, healthy bacteria. It's only the rare exceptions that have gone rogue, maybe because they get in a wrong place or because they've had damage to their DNA. Even most viruses, believe it or not, viruses are designed robotic features of our bodies. The vast majority perform important, useful, healthy, and good functions. Only the rare exceptions cause damage and destruction because they've gone bad since the time of the fall. So really, these examples that Attenborough brings up are no problem for the Bible-believing Christian. The Bible would explain both the good things about the world and the bad things as a consequence of sin. Not anybody's individual sin. I'm not saying, by the way, Jesus corrected that mistake that people made saying, oh, why was he born blind? Because his parents sinned or because he sinned? That's not what I'm talking about, but just sin in general, the curse on creation as a consequence of Adam's sin. Now, there's another well-known creation speaker who uses this analogy. He said he was once at a museum where he was observing these people standing around looking at all the amazing artifacts from Greek and Roman cultures, like the beautiful statues. And this crowd that was gathered was admiring the statue, right? They said things like, oh, it's so magnificent, it's so beautiful, it's so incredible. And I'll let you see that on the screen if this will, there we go, okay. But at the same time, there was a young boy standing nearby the crowd, and he said, what are you folks talking about? The statue looks broken to me. There it is. Now, both observations are actually true, aren't they? There's a remnant of beauty in these statues, exquisite design. They didn't come about by chance, but the statues are broken. Did you realize the same thing is true about the world that we live in? Attenborough might be right that we as creationists tend to look at the world and point people to beautiful rainbows and, orchids and sunflowers and so forth, hummingbirds. But the world is filled with disaster and death and famine and suffering and diseases and broken bones and much more. But that fits, even though we might want to say that the world is still magnificent, beautiful, incredible. My slide is not advancing there if you want to just skip ahead a couple. The same story is here too. The atheist is right to say it looks broken to me, but the Bible explains both the beauty and the ugliness. But the good news is that God is not going to leave things in that state. We believe that God is both creator and redeemer. Isn't that good news? As it says in Colossians chapter 1, once I get that on the screen, I'll read it for you. For in him, that is Jesus, all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether on earth or in heaven, making peace by the blood of his cross. One day God's going to make a new heavens and a new earth where there's no more pain, no more sorrow, no more suffering and death. The curse will be done away with. And as long as we know the Lord Jesus, we put our faith and trust in him and his work on the cross for our salvation, we can participate in that glorious future. So to summarize what we've learned tonight, we've looked at 4 reasons that are supposedly proofs of evolution, but just like that Martian hillside, it turns out the details are clear. When you dive into those details, they demonstrate these are better evidences for biblical creation. They're perfectly consistent with the truth of Genesis. We looked at vestigial structures and saw that the majority are functional after all, but an occasional broken piece of the world is not inconsistent with the Bible either. We looked at the similarities in living things, and we saw that these don't point to common ancestry, but to a common designer, one God who stands behind all these features. We looked at the changes that we can observe today. We saw that they don't add information, they're degrading information, they're changes within biblical kinds. And last, we looked at the cruelty in nature, and we saw that this is not inconsistent with the Bible. It is explained by a good world and a subsequent fall, thanks to Adam and Eve. So in sum, living things still shout design. Long after Darwin, we have more reason than ever. Science continues to discover amazing parts of nature, digging into the intricacies of the cell and DNA and so forth, and it demonstrates the truth of our Creator. So if you're interested in learning more about these subjects, biology or the creation and evolution controversy in general, we have a lot of resources that you might want to check out after we're dismissed. On the book table outside, we have a fantastic family-friendly magazine that I mentioned this morning, but you can still subscribe tonight. The digital version of the magazine is included at no extra charge. There's a 1-year or a 2-year option for a subscription. In every issue, you get interviews with Bible-believing PhD scientists or some other expert in science. You've also got features of living organisms that testify to the magnificence of the Creator. We had a cover story a while back about the mimic octopus that I'll show on the screen here. The mimic octopus. Now, you might have heard that many octopuses, they can change their skin to camouflage themselves, but the mimic is particularly remarkable. It changes its color, its texture, and its shape to actually impersonate other animals. So it might give itself black and white stripes to look like a poisonous sea snake, or it will, like it's imitating a flounder right here, a flatfish that swims on the ocean floor. Sometimes it pretends to be a lionfish with these like tentacles behind it, which is a poisonous creature that predators don't want to mess with. And just astonishing the amount of diversity and variety that God built into the animal and plant kingdoms and elsewhere in living things. And it testifies to the truth of creation. Some other resources that I'll mention. This is a great booklet that we have for high school and college students. If you're being taught, if you go to public school or even a Christian school often, you get taught evolution these days. If you want to know how to respond in the classroom, to be respectful, this has some practical do's and don'ts for students who are being taught evolutionary ideas. One more resource, I don't have a slide for this, but a relatively new book called By Design. If you want tons and tons of details about living things and how there are catapults in a chameleon's tongue, and how do wings work with like pulleys in the bird's arms, and colors, iridescent colors like blues that could not be explained by pigment and so forth. He goes into all the amazing scientific details and gives glory to the Creator. Lots more at our website, creation.com. We can find video content, 45 years worth of creation articles available at your fingertips. And I will leave you with this verse from Hebrews. And once we're done here, by the way, we're going to have some Q&A. So if you need to leave and make your purchases, my helper, Dr. Joshua Kohath, is at the back, and he can help you check out. But we're going to stay in this room for a little while and just have a Q&A time. So you might think about what questions you want to ask me once we're done here. But before that, I'll just read you this verse from Hebrews chapter 3 to summarize. In fact, the prior verse, I think Hebrews 3:3 talks about how there's a builder of a house gets glory or honor or something like that. And then it says, for every house is built by someone, but the builder of all things is God. So that's what the Bible reveals. That's what nature testifies to as well. Designing living things is not just an illusion that can be explained away. No, the more you examine these details, the more clear it is that creatures are the handiwork of their Creator. All right. So I will leave it there, and we're just going to go straight into question and answers. So does anybody have a question? You can just raise your hand. I'll call on you, and then you can stand up and just speak loudly, try to make everyone hear you, but I'll repeat the question if need be, and we'll just see how we go. Anything is fair game if it's on creation and evolution generally. Yeah, so who's got a question? All right, yes.
Okay. What are some examples of new genetic information being created within nature?
Yeah, well, that's kind of my question that I pose to evolutionists, because I don't think there are any super clear-cut examples of that. Now, some creationists will say there are no examples of new genetic information being created. I think we're a bit more cautious not to make a categorical statement that says there's absolutely zero. I just say they're so rare that we should have far more examples of them if evolution were true. And the typical examples they point to of changes that we can watch in real time, they say, oh, see, that's a change, it's proof of evolution. And then I say, hang on, let's look and see if it is an increase in information, and it almost invariably turns out it's not. But in my message here, I went through it quickly, so you might have missed it, but I did try to give an example of one that we could technically call new information arising, and it's when you have certain genes or parts of genes get duplicated, and I'm not an expert in all the genetics and how I probably couldn't give you the specifics about like one example of this, but my understanding from the geneticist we have on staff, Robert Carter, he's pointed out to me that when some of these get duplicated, that actually does impact how they get expressed. And so in some limited sense, you might say, yeah, I guess we could technically call that new information arising. If it's just an accidental change that duplicates this stretch, and then it's not harmful to the organism, and it's not just gobbledygook that does almost nothing, it actually might speed up a reaction process of how the gene is processed inside the cell, right? Then I think it's fair to say, okay, maybe that's in some limited sense new information arising by a mutation. But as I said, still, if it's just from a duplication, it's a duplication of a pre-existing stretch of DNA that was already there, that's really not that profound, and that's not the kind of change that by that process alone is going to generate a whole new type of organism, right? All it can do then is just copy what's already there, but there are lots of genes in different types of organisms that are look very unlike other genes. They're called orphan genes. So you might know that some genes we have, there's like families of genes almost, where you've got like this gene is very similar to this one over here, and it's very similar to this one over here. So there's a whole grouping of genes that look very similar, and you can understand how, at least according to the evolutionists, I don't believe this is true, but they could say, oh, there was original ancestor gene and that got copied and slightly changed. But then there's other ones that are so radically different than the others, they're called orphans. Like they're so distinct, they have no other relatives that look similar to them. So how do you explain those, right? So there's massive problems here. So I couldn't give you a super precise particular example, except for I think that general idea of a gene duplication might in some limited sense be one genuine example, but still a far cry from what evolutionists need, if that makes sense. All right, anybody else? Okay, I see, yes.
So in one of the slides that you showed, there was like an ultrasound thing.
Yeah,
Was that actually an ultrasound?
it was. That's actually my niece, Nora, when she was still in her mom's tummy. And she's now, I don't know how old she is, maybe 10 years old, something like that. So it's, I don't even know the term for what they call it. Isn't it like a 4D ultrasound? So they used to have just like two-dimensional black and white photos, but now from the image techniques that we're able to do, you get this and sometimes you can see videos of children in the womb that you can watch them moving around, and they look like that orange, splotchy stuff, but you can see them in 3 dimensions, and it's amazing. You can see them sometimes sucking their thumbs and so forth. So yeah, and the technology has really helped the Christian view, the biblical view, that from the time of conception we are human beings, and even though we go through stages of development, you'd say like a teenager is not the same as an adult, but both are human, right? And the same thing is true even if we're called a fetus or an embryo. What kind of a fetus or an embryo is it? It's not a horse fetus or a dog fetus or a cat fetus. It's a human fetus, a human embryo. So we're humans from the time we come into being, and we just go through stages of development in the womb. So that's why we're a pro-life ministry as well. Believe that we should not be killing children in their mother's wombs, but that they're valuable right from the time that they are conceived. So good question. Did you have a reason for asking that, or you were just curious?
I was just really curious.
Okay.
I didn't know what it was.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, it's my own niece. All right, anybody else? All right, another one here, yeah. Oh, you came prepared, very good.
Otherwise, I'd forget.
Yep, that's great. No, that's great.
She's also a teacher.
Nice. Yeah, we got to have lunch together, so it's great.
Okay. Why would animals who produce sterile offspring be considered the same kind
Yeah.
when God created kinds to be fruitful and multiply?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah. So some people might try to dispute that criterion. There's nothing in the Bible that says if animals can hybridize, that proves they're the same kind. But I think it's actually ironically partly based on what you just said, that God designed them to be fruitful and multiply, to bring forth after their kind. I think that gives us a clue that if they can produce offspring, then they belong to one kind. So the reason why some today might be, like a horse and a donkey produce a mule, is that right? And then the mules are typically sterile. To me, the fact that the horse and the donkey can produce offspring suggests that they're one kind, but then why would you have the sterility that you can't go another generation further? Well, that's just because of all the, I don't know specifically, but there's all kinds of complex things that do occur in biology that can get damaged over time and break down. And so, or maybe once the DNA got sorted out, like if God created one equine kind, that includes like horses and donkeys and zebras and mules and so forth, that after they got diversified, some of that I understand even involves different numbers of chromosomes in their DNA. And so then it might just be hard to go back the other direction and reunite them again because of either just the sorting out of the original information that was there or because of damage that's occurred in one lineage or another, and then you can't come back and reproduce. Now, my understanding, by the way, is that occasionally you will get a fertile mule. So even rarely with those, it can happen. But, you might just think about it like they're infertile couples today, right? Like things go wrong in biology for all kinds of reasons. There are all kinds of reasons why people have trouble having offspring. But you can see how they're two human beings that just something's been broken in the process. And even if it happened for a whole, one species within a kind has a hard time mating with another species from the same kind, I think the fact that you can have the hybridization in the first place suggests to me that they belong to the same kind. So somebody's free to dispute that, but to me that seems logical, if that helps. Yeah, all right, yes, sir.
Couldn't that be the Lord's stopgap measure? The two different species of the same kind, but then the offspring sterile, wouldn't that be kind of a stopgap measure for the mutations?
Yeah, it could be. I don't know for sure if God doesn't want it for some reason, or maybe what you're saying is he just, because some other things are wrong in them, that if they were to hybridize, it would be a disaster. Maybe so. I don't really know enough about it, but it's a good thought. All right. Anybody else? You could ask about the things I talked about tonight, or this morning, or just general creation and evolution issues. Or if not, we can be done. You can ask me things one-on-one if you like. All right, last chance. Okay, well, if you want more, there's plenty more in the resources as well. So should we call it there? Do you want to say anything to close, or you want me to just pray us out? I'll pray us out. Okay, all right. Well, thank you all for being here tonight. It was great to meet with you and interact with you. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, we do thank you for our time today to get into your word and to think through some of these issues together. I thank you for the great questions even just now. And Lord, I pray that you do help us to be people that use our minds for your glory. Whether we're really interested in science or it's not our thing, I pray that you just help us to know you better, know your word better, hide it deep within our hearts, and then to live it out and to have the courage to live according to what you commanded us in your word, Lord. Help us to know the truth, and we thank you that it does set us free, and that truth comes from you. And it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. All right. Thanks all.
Thank you.